My name is Ibrahim Traore. I stand before you as the president of Burkina Faso, a son of the Sahel, a Muslim by faith, and a servant of a nation that has known both suffering and resilience. I speak today not as a preacher and not as a judge, but as a witness. What I am about to recount is not a tale of politics alone. It is a story about faith, pride, consequence, and mercy. In the year 2026, across the Sahel region, in a climate that carries the spirit of northern Nigeria, Ghana, and Mali, there rose a man named Malik Kamanzi. He was not from my country, yet his story reached our borders like harmattan dust carried by wind. He was a powerful leader, ambitious, determined, convinced that history would remember him as a builder of greatness. He announced a grand project, a luxurious retreat for high-ranking officials, a symbol of national progress, a modern estate designed to impress investors and dignitaries. It was to stand as a monument of development in a region long associated with hardship. But there was a problem. On the land chosen for this project stood an old Christian church. It was not large. It was not decorated with gold. Its walls were simple. Its roof carried the scars of many rainy seasons. Yet inside those walls, generations had prayed. Children had been baptized. Couples had been married. The elderly had sung hymns that echoed into the dry Sahel sky. To the planners, it was a structure. To the community, it was their soul. Malik Kamanzi gave the order to demolish it. He did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as practical. He believed progress required sacrifice. He believed faith could relocate. But land remembers, people remember. And sometimes, God allows consequences to unfold slowly enough for all of us to learn. I will now tell you what followed. When Malik Kamanzi's order became public, it did not spread like ordinary news. It spread like fire across dry grass. In villages and towns near the site, church bells rang longer than usual that Sunday, not in celebration but in warning. Word traveled through market stalls, through family courtyards, through whispered phone calls late at night. The believers did not react with violence, they reacted with prayer. Men and women gathered in front of the old church at dawn. Some brought stools, some brought mats, some brought nothing but their worn Bibles. They knelt on red Sahel soil that had felt the weight of their knees for decades. They prayed day and night. Elderly women with gray hair wrapped in cloth sang hymns in voices that trembled but did not break. Young men stood with folded arms, not shouting, not threatening, but standing as living walls. The pastors and elders stepped forward carefully. They did not insult the government. They did not threaten revolt. They wrote letters. They requested meetings. They appealed to conscience. They said, "This is not just a building, this is our inheritance." To them, the church was not cement and wood. It was memory. It was forgiveness spoken over coffins. It was hope whispered during drought. It was the place where broken marriages were healed and lost sons returned. They pleaded for reconsideration. They asked that the project move a few kilometers away. The Sahel is wide. Land is abundant. Surely there was another place. But from the capital, the message was firm. Development cannot wait. The state media began to speak in a different tone. Commentators described the project as a symbol of national transformation. They spoke of economic growth. They spoke of global image. They spoke of prestige. And slowly, those who prayed were portrayed as obstacles. I have seen this before in our region. When power speaks of vision, it sometimes stops listening to pain. The gatherings in front of the church grew larger. Not only Christians came, some Muslims came quietly, standing at the edge, not kneeling but observing. Because even when faith traditions differ, people recognize injustice. There is something universal about sacred ground. Whether it is a mosque, a church, or a simple tree under which elders pray, communities understand when something holy is threatened. Day turned into night, night into day. Candles flickered under the open sky. Children fell asleep on their mothers' laps while prayers continued. The air felt heavy, not with anger but with sorrow. Malik Kamanzi watched from a distance. His advisors told him this would pass. They said resistance is always loud at first. He believed them. He believed that determination would outlast devotion. But here is the first lesson, my friends. Power can issue commands. Faith gathers people. And when faith gathers, it does not measure strength in numbers alone. It measures strength in conviction. The believers were not fighting for property. They were defending meaning. And meaning is stronger than machinery. I speak this as a Muslim leader. I understand what it means when a call to prayer echoes from a mosque that has stood for generations. I understand what it means when sacred space carries memory. Even those who do not share a creed should respect what gives others dignity. But Malik did not see it that way. He saw protest. He saw delay. He saw defiance. He did not yet see consequence. And so the wave of resistance rose higher. What followed was not peaceful dialogue. It was escalation. The morning the security forces arrived, the sky was pale and windless. There is a particular silence that comes before confrontation. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is heavy, the kind of silence where even birds seem to hesitate. The believers were already gathered. They had prayed through the night again. Some were tired, some were afraid, but they remained seated in front of the church doors, holding hands, holding Bibles, holding rosaries. Then the trucks appeared. Uniformed officers stepped down, not shouting at first. Their orders were clear. Clear the area, remove the obstruction, restore public order. The officials described it as routine enforcement, but nothing about that morning felt routine. A loudspeaker announced that the assembly was unauthorized. The crowd was instructed to disperse. Some began to weep quietly. Some began to sing louder. One elderly pastor, a man whose hair had turned white inside that very church decades earlier, stepped forward. He did not insult the officers. He asked for time. He said, "Give us one more meeting, one more conversation." The answer was no. When force begins, it rarely begins at full volume. It starts with pushing, then grabbing, then pulling people from the ground. Women who had prayed peacefully were lifted and moved aside. Young men who stood as silent walls were restrained. Those who resisted physically were detained. Some were arrested under the charge of disturbing public order. The state media that evening showed only selected images. They spoke of stability. They spoke of the necessity of discipline. They called the project a symbol of national development. Words can be arranged to justify almost anything. The narrative was simple. The nation must move forward. Progress cannot be held hostage by emotion. But I ask you, especially those of you who are older and have lived through many administrations in your own countries, when has silencing prayer ever brought peace? As the arrests continued, something shifted in the community. Fear entered. Not fear of imprisonment alone, but fear that their voices no longer mattered. Fear that their faith was being treated as inconvenience. Families visited police stations. Mothers carried food to detained sons. Lawyers tried to intervene. Meanwhile, bulldozers waited at a distance. Malik Kamanzi received updates throughout the day. His advisors assured him that firmness now would prevent greater unrest later. He convinced himself that leadership requires hard decisions, and it does. But there is a difference between strength and stubbornness. The church doors remained standing that evening, but the atmosphere had changed. The gatherings were smaller now. Some people stayed home, frightened of arrest. Others came quietly, kneeling without banners, without cameras, because faith does not depend on permission. What pained me most when I later heard this story was not the arrests. Governments everywhere, including my own, have security forces. Order matters. What pained me was the tone. When leaders begin to speak of their own citizens as obstacles, something in the moral compass begins to bend. The Sahel is a region already wounded by conflict and extremism. We do not need new wounds created by pride. Malik believed that once the crowd was cleared, resistance would dissolve. He believed that removing bodies from the front of the church meant removing conviction from their hearts. But faith does not live in crowds alone. It lives in conscience. And conscience cannot be detained. The arrests were the first crack in the foundation of his certainty. He did not know it yet. But something had already begun to shift. Demolition was scheduled to begin at sunrise. The crowd had been reduced. The security perimeter was firm. Media crews aligned their cameras to capture what they called the first step toward transformation. Malik Kamanzi arrived briefly that morning. He wore a calm expression, the expression of a man certain of his decision. He gave short remarks about progress, unity, and the future. Then the machines moved forward. The first bulldozer advanced slowly toward the outer fence. Its engine roared, powerful and confident. Then it stopped. At first, no one was concerned. Machines stalled. Operators restarted it. It coughed, rattled, then shut down again. Mechanics stepped in. They checked fuel lines, wiring, ignition. The vehicle had been serviced days before. Everything had passed inspection. They restarted it again. It moved a few meters, then died. A second bulldozer was brought forward. It moved closer to the foundation of the church, its blade pressed against a section of wall that had stood through decades of wind and heat. The engine strained, then smoke rose from beneath the hood. Within minutes, that machine too was disabled. Those present began whispering. Engineers dismissed it as coincidence. Mechanical failure happens. The Sahel dust can interfere with systems. Heat can stress equipment. Malik was informed. He frowned but did not waver. He ordered replacements. By midday, a smaller team of workers attempted manual removal of stones along the outer base. It was an old structure, and part of its foundation consisted of hand-placed stones. One particular stone drew attention. It was not large, it did not appear heavy. 2 men attempted to lift it, it did not move. 4 men tried, they adjusted their grip, they strained harder. It remained fixed. They called for more help. 6 men together tried to dislodge it. Nothing. Some laughed nervously, others stepped back. One worker later said he felt an unease standing on that ground. He could not explain it, he simply felt uncomfortable, as if something in the air resisted. Another said he heard faintly what sounded like a bell echoing in his mind. There were no bells. Stories began circulating quickly among the workers. Malik dismissed them. He publicly stated that superstition would not guide national development. He ordered the team to continue. And this is where I must speak carefully. I do not claim miracles. I do not declare curses. I do not build theology on mechanical breakdowns. But I have lived long enough to know that when a leader ignores the spiritual weight of a place, unexpected resistance often emerges. Not always supernatural. Sometimes psychological. Sometimes moral. Sometimes simply the consequence of pushing forward without wisdom. The demolition was delayed that day. By evening, the machines had been towed away for further inspection. The church still stood. The believers who had been praying quietly at a distance watched from behind barriers. They did not cheer. They did not mock. They knelt again. Malik returned to the capital irritated but unmoved. He called the events minor setbacks. He instructed engineers to ensure that by the next week, the structure would be down. Yet something subtle had changed. Doubt had entered the room. When a project meets resistance from machinery, from workers' instincts, from the very ground beneath it, even the most rational mind begins to wonder. But pride has a way of silencing doubt. And pride, when combined with authority, becomes difficult to challenge. The following week, demolition resumed. This time, the walls came down. Brick by brick, the old church was reduced to rubble. The strange stone was finally removed using heavy lifting equipment and placed aside among debris. To some, it was victory. To others, it was heartbreak. To Malik, it was proof that determination prevails. He believed the difficult part was over. He did not yet understand that the real resistance had only begun. Because destroying a structure is one thing. Building over what it meant is another. Once the church had been reduced to rubble, the mood among Malik Kamanzi's inner circle shifted from tension to triumph. Plans were displayed, architectural renderings circulated in glossy brochures. The retreat complex would include private villas, conference halls, landscape gardens, and a secure perimeter. It was described as a jewel rising from the Sahel. The debris was cleared, the ground was leveled. Surveyors marked precise lines where new foundations would be poured. Concrete trucks arrived at dawn 1 week later. The first foundation slab was laid under strict supervision. Engineers double-checked measurements. Materials were imported at high cost to guarantee durability. Malik did not want mediocrity. He wanted perfection. Within days, hairline cracks appeared. At first, they were dismissed as surface shrinkage, normal, cosmetic. Then the cracks widened. Engineers ordered reinforcement. They poured additional concrete. They added steel supports. They recalculated weight distribution. The ground shifted again. The cracks returned, spreading like veins across the surface. A second attempt was made on a different section of the site. This time, soil tests were conducted again. The land had previously supported a building for decades without issue. There had been no reports of unstable earth. Yet now, the newly poured base fractured in irregular patterns. Workers whispered quietly among themselves. Some remembered the strange resistance during demolition. Some avoided eye contact when supervisors approached. Walls began rising despite the setbacks. The project had momentum, and no leader wants to admit failure mid-construction. But as walls climbed, new problems emerged. Discolorations appeared on the plaster. Dark stains seeped through fresh paint without explanation. Sections of wall developed thin fractures that widened overnight. The Sahel is known for its dry season. For months, skies often remain clear and merciless. Yet during that period, unexpected rains began to fall. They were not catastrophic storms. They were persistent and poorly timed. Concrete that needed uninterrupted curing was soaked. Equipment that required dryness malfunctioned. Roads leading to the site turned muddy at critical delivery moments. Transport trucks carrying specialized materials broke down along remote stretches of road. Engines overheated, tires burst, deliveries were delayed again and again. On paper, none of these incidents proved anything extraordinary. Engineers documented each problem with technical explanations. Weather patterns fluctuate, materials sometimes fail. Logistics in West Africa are complex. And yet, when setbacks accumulate in sequence, even rational minds begin to sense imbalance. Malik's advisors urged patience. They reassured investors. Public statements described the delays as minor adjustments within a dynamic project. But privately, frustration grew. Budgets swelled, deadlines shifted, contractors argued. And here is something I want to share with you, especially those of you who have managed businesses or led institutions in your own countries. When a foundation is built on contested moral ground, instability often shows itself in practical ways. Not because God strikes concrete with lightning, but because the human spirit carries unresolved conflict into every decision that follows. Workers felt uneasy. Some believed the land was resisting. Some believed the project carried a shadow. Morale declined. Productivity slowed. In leadership, morale is as crucial as material. Malik, however, refused to interpret events through spiritual lenses. He doubled oversight. He demanded stricter supervision. He replaced contractors he suspected of incompetence. Yet the pattern persisted. One evening, as he reviewed reports, he paused longer than usual. He did not speak it aloud, but the question flickered briefly in his mind. Was this simply engineering failure? Or had he underestimated the weight of what once stood there? Still, pride answered before humility could form. He pressed forward. The structure continued rising, but never smoothly. Every step required correction. Every phase encountered resistance. What was meant to symbolize effortless progress became a symbol of continuous repair. And when projects begin to drain more than they produce, they start to drain the leader as well. The land where prayers once echoed now echoed with arguments. The air felt different, not cursed, but unsettled. And what happens externally often begins to mirror what is forming internally. Malik's nights were about to change. It began quietly. Malik Kamanzi had always slept soundly. He was a disciplined man. Military routine had shaped his body and mind. He believed in control, in order, in self-command. But several weeks into the construction delays, his nights grew restless. The first dream was vague. He stood alone on the construction site at dusk. The building was half complete, skeletal against a darkening sky. In the distance, he heard something faint. A bell? Not loud, not alarming, just steady. He woke before he could locate its source. He dismissed it as stress. Leadership carries pressure. Major projects create tension. Dreams are nothing more than the mind reorganizing conflict. The second dream came 3 nights later. This time he stood where the old church altar had once been. There was no building around him, only open ground. He heard murmured voices, like distant prayer carried by wind. He could not see faces. He could not distinguish words. But the tone was unmistakable. Petition, supplication, then the bell again. He woke abruptly, heart racing. He did not tell anyone, but sleep grew thinner, shorter, fragmented. Soon, the dreams were accompanied by waking unease. He found himself pausing when passing the site during daylight. A sensation he could not define lingered. Not fear exactly. Not guilt, he would consciously admit. Discomfort. At the same time, events inside his home shifted. One of his children fell ill suddenly. Nothing dramatic at first. Fever. Weakness. Doctors found no clear cause. Tests returned inconclusive. Then another child developed unexplained symptoms. Fatigue. Recurring pain. His wife, who had supported him publicly, grew anxious privately. She asked if the stress of the project was worth it. She suggested consulting both medical specialists and spiritual counsel. Malik bristled at the idea that personal hardship could be linked to professional decisions. He believed in separation, governance on one side, family on the other. But human life rarely separates so neatly. The nights worsened. In one dream, he stood before the old church doors again. They were intact, as if never demolished. He reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, he heard children singing inside. A hymn, soft, clear. He could not enter. He woke with tears in his eyes, though he did not understand why. Now, I speak carefully here. I am not declaring supernatural punishment. Illness visits many households without moral explanation. Dreams arise from stress and conscience alike. But there is a psychological truth older than any nation. When leaders act against the deeply held convictions of their people, something within them often registers the conflict, even if they refuse to acknowledge it publicly. Malik began avoiding discussion of the church entirely. In meetings, he redirected conversation toward budgets and timelines. At home, he became quieter. His wife noticed. She asked him directly one evening, "Do you believe this was right?" He did not answer immediately. For the first time since the project began, the question did not irritate him. It unsettled him. Meanwhile, construction issues persisted. Repairs consumed funds. Investors requested clarification. Opposition voices grew louder, though carefully worded. And in the quiet of the night, the bell continued. Not audible in the physical sense, but persistent in his mind. It is one thing to silence citizens. It is another thing to silence your own conscience. Malik began visiting the site less frequently. When he did, he stayed inside vehicles, observing from a distance. The land no longer felt like triumph. It felt heavy. Then, just as his internal world began to crack, his external world fractured. Because hidden things rarely remain hidden forever. And what was buried long before the church demolition was about to surface. The investigation did not begin with the church. It began with a routine financial audit. At least, that is how it was presented. In many governments across Africa and beyond, periodic reviews of public expenditure are normal. Contracts are examined. Procurement procedures are reviewed. Discrepancies are flagged quietly and often resolved internally. But this time, something different happened. A mid-level financial officer noticed irregularities in contracts that predated the church demolition. Payments authorized under Malik Kamanzi's earlier development programs did not fully align with documented deliverables. Small inconsistencies at first, then larger ones. Funds allocated for infrastructure had been redirected. Shell companies appeared in the paperwork. Signatures overlapped in suspicious ways. The officer hesitated. Reporting such findings can be dangerous. Careers end over less. But the evidence mounted. Eventually, documents were submitted to an independent oversight committee. What followed unfolded quickly. Leaked records surfaced online. Journalists began asking questions not about the resort project, but about financial transparency. Opposition leaders, who had remained cautious during the church dispute, now found firm ground. The story shifted. Headlines no longer centered on a demolished church, they centered on alleged corruption. Investigators traced transfers across multiple accounts. Some funds appeared connected to luxury purchases abroad, others seemed tied to political allies. Malik was stunned. He had believed that whatever administrative shortcuts had occurred were buried in layers of bureaucracy. He believed loyalty would hold. But paper trails have a way of resurfacing. And when public trust has already been weakened by moral controversy, financial suspicion spreads faster. Within weeks, formal inquiries were announced. Malik addressed the nation, denying intentional wrongdoing. He framed the accusations as politically motivated. He promised cooperation. But momentum had shifted. Support within his own party fractured. Some allies distanced themselves publicly. International partners requested clarification. The project site, once presented as a symbol of progress, became a backdrop for criticism. Then came the suspension. Pending investigation, he was temporarily relieved of certain executive powers. It was described as procedural, not punitive. Days later, formal charges were filed. Malik Kamanzi, the man who had commanded bulldozers to erase a church, was now escorted by security personnel into a courthouse. Not as a commander, as a defendant. The images circulated widely. Some who had prayed in front of the church did not celebrate. They watched in silence. Because this was no longer about a building. It was about integrity. I must say something here clearly. The exposure of corruption was not caused by supernatural revenge. It was not lightning striking from heaven. It was the natural consequence of systems eventually correcting themselves. But timing carries symbolism. When a leader disregards the sacred convictions of his people, and then his own hidden actions are revealed, observers will draw connections. Whether spiritual or structural, the pattern feels like warning. Malik was placed under investigation and later formally detained pending trial. The Grand Retreat project was halted indefinitely. Construction equipment sat idle. Half-built walls stood exposed to sun and rain. What had been announced as a jewel became a scar. And in quiet homes across the region, people began repeating a simple phrase. Pride goes before a fall. Not as mockery, as reflection. Malik now had long nights not in a presidential residence, but in a holding facility. And there, without advisors, without cameras, without applause, a man confronts himself. What happens in those private hours is known only to God and to the man himself. But the nation moved forward without him, and the land where prayers once rose remained unfinished. When Malik Kamanzi lost his authority, the energy surrounding the project vanished almost overnight. Contracts were frozen, investors withdrew cautiously, government statements grew vague and infrequent. The language of certainty was replaced with the language of review. The construction site fell silent. Half-finished walls stood under the Sahel sun, exposed and uneven. Steel rods protruded upward, like questions without answers. Cement slabs, once polished with intention, began collecting dust and rainwater. No official declared the project dead at first, but everyone understood. Work crews stopped arriving, security patrols thinned. Over time, even the perimeter fences sagged. Children from nearby communities began wandering close to the abandoned structure. They stared at the skeletal remains with curiosity. Elders shook their heads when passing by. What was once described as a symbol of national progress had become a symbol of something else entirely. A reminder. The land carried memory, not in mystical language, in lived experience. People remembered the prayers, the arrests, the bulldozers, the cracked foundations, the scandal, the courtroom. Stories began circulating in homes and markets. Some said the land had rejected arrogance. Some said God had defended his house. Others, more cautious, simply said that when leaders forget humility, consequences follow. The abandoned structure slowly deteriorated, rains weakened exposed concrete, metal rusted, paint peeled before completion. No plaque was ever installed. No ribbon was cut. It became a quiet monument to ambition without reflection. In many nations, including my own, there are projects that begin with fanfare and end in silence. This was one of them. But something interesting happened in the community that had once gathered in front of the church. They did not organize celebrations. They organized prayer, not prayer for victory, prayer for restoration. The stone that had resisted lifting during demolition had been placed among debris at the edge of the property. It remained there, half covered in dust, almost forgotten. Yet to some members of the community, that stone symbolized something deeper, endurance. They began speaking quietly about rebuilding. Not on the exact contested ground at first. Discussions were cautious, tensions still lingered, but the idea took root. If the project would not rise, perhaps something else should. This is where leadership matters again. Interim authorities, seeking stability, chose not to reignite conflict. They opened channels for dialogue with religious leaders. They listened. And in listening, they did what Malik had not done. They acknowledged that development and dignity must walk together. Eventually, approval was granted for reconstruction of the church near the original location. It was not a grand cathedral. It was not funded by the state. It was funded by ordinary believers. Men and women contributed small amounts. Some sold livestock. Some donated savings. Some traveled from distant towns to offer support. Even a few Muslims quietly gave contributions, not out of conversion, but out of solidarity. Because when sacred space is restored, community heals. The abandoned retreat structure remained untouched, a silent backdrop to this new effort. It stood as contrast, ambition on one side, faith on the other, and slowly, the community prepared to lay a new foundation. But this time, they did not begin with machinery. They began with prayer. The day the rebuilding began, there were no state cameras, no speeches from powerful offices, no grand promises of economic transformation. There were only hands. Weathered hands, wrinkled hands, young hands calloused from farming, women's hands that had once wiped tears during the demolition. They gathered at sunrise on the cleared ground near where the old church had stood. The abandoned retreat structure loomed in the distance, half-finished and silent. Rust had begun marking its edges. It no longer felt imposing, it felt hollow. But on this morning, attention shifted away from that ruin. A simple wooden cross had been placed at the center of the new site. Beside it lay the stone that had once resisted being lifted during demolition. It had been cleaned carefully, not polished into something grand, simply washed, handled gently, respected. When the community elders spoke, they did not speak of revenge. They did not speak of triumph over a fallen leader. They spoke of forgiveness. They spoke of rebuilding not only walls, but trust. As president of Burkina Faso and as a Muslim, I listened closely to accounts of that day. Because what moved me was not the structure itself. It was the spirit. The stone that had once required heavy machinery to remove was now lifted with coordinated effort, not by brute force alone, but by cooperation. Several men positioned themselves carefully. Others supported from the sides. They lifted together, and this time, it moved. Was it lighter? Was it placed differently? Was it simply alignment and balance? Engineers might explain it in physical terms. But to those present, it symbolized something deeper. The stone was placed at the corner of the new foundation, not as superstition. As remembrance, construction proceeded steadily. No mysterious delays, no cracked foundations. The soil, tested again, supported the structure without complication. The rains that had complicated the retreat project followed their normal seasonal rhythm. The dry season returned predictably, transport deliveries arrived on time. Of course, rebuilding a modest church requires fewer resources than a luxury estate, but morale was different. Workers sang as they built. Women prepared food for volunteers. Children carried small buckets of water, eager to participate. What had once been a site of tension became a site of unity. On the day of dedication, thousands gathered. Elderly believers who had knelt in protest stood now with tears in their eyes. Some remembered baptisms that had taken place in the old church decades earlier. Some had buried loved ones whose funerals were held there. Hymns filled the air again. And I was told that when the bell rang for the first time in the rebuilt church, its sound carried far across the Sahel wind. Not as defiance, as restoration. No official government delegation dominated the ceremony. Representatives attended respectfully but quietly. This was not about political capital. It was about healing. Even among Muslims in the region, there was acknowledgement that something important had occurred. We do not strengthen our nations by erasing each other's sacred spaces. We strengthen them by protecting them. The abandoned retreat remained unfinished. Eventually, authorities decided to dismantle what could not be salvaged. Materials were repurposed for public schools and clinics. The skeletal remains were removed piece by piece. In time, grass grew where ambition once stood, but the church remained. Simple, solid, filled each week with voices in prayer. And Malik Kamanzi? His legal process continued. Some charges were upheld, some were contested. History will record the final verdict. But his story had already become lesson, not because of mystical punishment, but because pride, when untempered by humility, isolates leaders from the very people they are meant to serve. The rebuilt church did not stand as victory over a man. It stood as testimony that faith endures beyond policy. And as I reflect on this story, I ask myself, and I ask you, was it coincidence that foundations cracked? Was it coincidence that hidden corruption surfaced when moral tension rose? Or was it simply the natural unfolding of consequence when conscience is ignored? The land does not speak in words, but history does. And this history speaks quietly, clearly. Power may command, but faith remembers. I have told you this story not to condemn a man and not to elevate myself. I have told it because leadership in our time is fragile. I speak as Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, a Muslim who believes in the one God, and a servant of a region where Muslims and Christians have lived side by side for generations. In the Sahel, survival has always depended on cooperation. We have faced terrorism, we have faced poverty, we have faced political instability. We cannot afford wars of ego. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this clearly. Protecting the dignity of Christians does not weaken Islam. It strengthens justice. The Quran teaches accountability. It warns against arrogance. It reminds rulers that authority is a trust. To my Christian friends, especially those watching from America and the United Kingdom, many of you who have walked with Christ for decades, who have seen leaders rise and fall, who have buried friends and prayed through wars, you understand something deeply. Faith cannot be bulldozed. It can be mocked. It can be restricted. It can be sidelined, but it cannot be erased. When Malik Kamanzi ordered the church destroyed, he believed he was removing an obstacle. What he removed instead was his own moral anchor. That is the danger for all of us who hold power. We begin by adjusting something small. We justify it as necessary. We silence a warning voice. We move forward with confidence. Then, slowly, consequences assemble around us. Sometimes they appear in cracked foundations. Sometimes in public scandal. Sometimes in restless nights. Sometimes in family strain. Not as magic, as his oath. The world today is watching leaders closely. In Africa, in Europe, in North America. Citizens are not perfect, but they recognize humility when they see it, and they recognize pride as well. I do not claim that every misfortune is divine intervention, but I do believe this. When leaders stop listening to conscience, the collapse begins inside long before it appears outside. The abandoned retreat became a lesson without a classroom. No professor needed to explain it. Children could see it and ask questions. Why is that building unfinished? And elders would answer gently, because ambition ran ahead of wisdom. The rebuilt church stands for something different, not political victory, not religious dominance. It stands for endurance. And endurance is built not only with concrete, but with conviction. I want good things for Africa. I want stability for the Sahel. I want peace between Muslim and Christian. I want leaders who measure success not only in projects completed, but in trust preserved. I also want something for the world beyond our region. To those of you over 50 who have seen governments change many times, who have watched history repeat itself in different costumes, you know this truth already. Character matters. A leader who kneels before God, in whatever tradition he sincerely follows, governs differently than a leader who kneels only before applause. We must turn away from corruption. We must turn away from arrogance. We must turn away from the temptation to silence those who disagree. We must return to humility. If you hold office, govern with reverence. If you hold influence, use it with restraint. If you hold faith, practice it with compassion. The question remains open. Was what happened to Malik coincidence or warning? Each of you will answer that in your own heart. But let us not wait for cracked foundations to correct us. Let us choose wisdom before consequence forces it upon us. I pray for Burkina Faso. I pray for Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, and every nation of the Sahel. I pray for America and the United Kingdom. I pray for Muslim and Christian alike. May we protect each other's sacred spaces. May we resist pride. May we remember that power is temporary, but moral legacy endures. If this story has moved you, reflect on it. Speak about it with your families. Share your thoughts with others who care about leadership and faith. Conversations matter. Communities grow stronger when people engage thoughtfully. And if you wish to hear more reflections like this, remain connected. Stay attentive. Support platforms that encourage serious discussion rather than division. Quiet encouragement often shapes stronger dialogue than loud argument. I close with this affirmation, not as a slogan, but as responsibility. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. These things I have spoken are true.